So with those online, just raise your hand, and those in the room just verbalize something I can hear. Alligator Fisheries.
Here.
Alligator Fisheries Society. Yeah, I thought so. Okay. Active Guide and Tackle. I just was talking to them. Yeah. Annieville Halibut Association.
Here.
BC Tuna Fishing Association. BC Tuna. Who's Patricia Phillips?
She's with US.
Okay, she's got her hand up.
I would continue.
BC Wildlife Federation. Council of Haida Nation. Okay. Commercial Integrated Groundfish Society. Canadian Sablefish Association. Present. Yeah. Finest at Sea Seafoods.
Yeah.
Halibut Advisory Board.
Yep.
Halibut Longline Fishermen's Association.
Here.
Hook and Line Groundfish Association.
Here.
Island IMOG. I thought I saw her online. Island Marine Aquatic Working Group. Yeah, she says she can hear us. Okay. Northern Halibut Producers Association.
Here.
Northern Trollers Association. Yes. The Child Tribal Council. So Cliff Atleo is not meeting us, so I'll be voting for him. Pacific Coast Fishing Vessel Owner Guide Guild.
Yes.
Pacific Halibut Management Association.
Here.
Sports Fishing Advisory Board, Maine. Martin, okay. Sports Fishing Advisory Board, North Coast. I think Michael Fowler, yep. He's there. Sports Fishing Advisory Board, South. Chris, I think you're representing them today. You put your hand up. So I want to check, see if Chris is there. Seashell Fishing Company, Christopher. He was here earlier today. Sports Fishing Institute of BC. Owen, yeah. Stevenson Halibut Association.
Here.
South Vancouver Island Anglers Coalition, I think they're down there. United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union.
Here.
Vancouver Island Longline Association. No. West Coast Fishing Guides Association. Okay. Did I miss anyone from the Canadian side? Either online or in the room? Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna go through the US list. There's 2 people who have requested accreditation. We'll do that after we go through the list. And there's 1 or 2 people where I'm missing the name of who's representing, so I'm gonna ask for that if I get to your name. And I think someone has a mic on down there. Thanks, Phil. Okay, Area 4 Concerned Harvesters. Not here. Okay, we're not going to get a name. Aleut Corps. Here. Thank you. Alaska Charter Association.
Here.
Great. ADAC Community Development Corps.
Here.
Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association.
Here.
APICTA. Here. American Sport Fishing Association. Are they online? No. Okay. Alaska Whitefish Trawlers Association, Bristol Bay Economic Development Corps,
Here.
Catch Association.
Here.
Cape Barnabas. Not, okay. CBSFA. Their person is, I think, online, right?
They're up there. Ready?
Ray is, okay,
You've got a hand up.
great. Got you, Ray. We have Joe listed, but is Ray gonna be the rep? Is that right?
That's correct. Ray will be the rep.
Okay. All right. Coastal Conservation Association,
Here.
CDFU, Coastal Trollers Association. No one online for that either?
I haven't heard anything.
Okay, so we don't have them, I think. Deep Sea Fishermen's Union, Freezer Longline Coalition, FVOA,
Here.
Humboldt Area Saltwater Anglers,
Here.
Halibut Coalition, Homer Charter Association, K-Bay Fisheries, I'm not here this year, Cruise Off Fisheries, not here, Kodiak Vessel Owners Association,
Here.
Next Generation Fishermen's Association,
Here.
North Pacific Fishery Association, Pacific Fishing Inc. That's Patty online, I think. Okay, Puget Sound Angler, oh, wait, we're gonna come back to you. PVOA, Recreational Fishing Alliance National. No, not online. I'll let you check online, okay? SEFA, Southeast Alaska, Kathy's there. Okay, SECO, Sablefish and Halibut Pod Association. Not here this year. Sitka Halibut and Sablefish Marketing Association. SPC, Carter's online. Carter Hughes, yeah, he's got his hand up. Okay. St. Paul Fishing Company,
Here.
Tribal Government of St. Paul. They got their hand up. Simeon,
Online?
yep, Simeon Sweatsoff online. United Fishermen's Marketing Association. Don't have them. Okay. Westport Charter Boat. No. Simeon is for Tribal Government St.
Okay.
Paul. Okay. Westport Charter Boat Association. No? Okay. Yukon Delta Fisheries Development Association.
Here.
Awesome. Okay, then we have two requests for accreditation. Okay, well, two US. The first is Magic Fish Company, Buck Lakaitis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you want me to speak to who Magic Fish Company is, or?
Yeah, just briefly, the key things are, that you represent harvesters, how many harvesters, areas you participate in. That's
Yeah.
probably what we need to hear.
Happy to do that. So Magic Fish Company has 3 vessels. All three skippers are all IFQ holders. Myself, my wife, both kids are IFQ holders. Magic Fish Company has it's home-based in Homer, but primarily operates in Area 3B and all Area 4A, 4C, not in 4 Bravo. I've been on the conference board for 12 years with MPFA previously, and then I think I was represented 3B, 4A False Pass that morphed into Garrett's group. But I've been a frequent participant, and it's definitely a private company. It's not a green group. It's commercial harvester. Thank you.
Do we have to have a vote? Yeah. Okay. Any objection to accrediting Magic Fish Company from US conference board members? Okay. And so now, lucky you, you get a clicker. All right, and then our other new applicant is Puget Sound Anglers Ocean Chapter. Is Dave Johnson in the room or online?
I think he's online, or should be online.
Okay. Dave, can you hear us and can you speak up?
We can't see him online.
Yeah, I don't see him online. Someone want to text him to,
We did hear he had some family emergency and.
Ah,
that's
okay.
why-
All right, so he may not be joining us, but, so if he does, we'll add him in. Okay, turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I missed the new one. So the new one for accreditation here is the Seashell Fishing Company is, Christopher was here yesterday and this morning. I don't see him online and I don't see him here. So the Seashell Fishing Company is what we call a commercial fishing enterprise. So it's part of the PICFI group. So it's a First Nation, the Seashell First Nation. They harvest, or they have a number of licenses and quotas, including halibut. So they meet the criteria that we've laid out in the application. Is there any objection to the Seashell Fishing Company being part of being accredited? Okay. But he's not here and he's not here online either. So he was earlier, but I guess he had something else to do or had to go somewhere. Okay.
Okay, I didn't count out how many we had accredited, but
Well, so we accredited.
no, but I mean, our total, we'll just get that, just for when we're voting. Okay.
Yeah, it's 20.
All right, so I think our next order of business is to have you adopt the agenda. But before you do that, we just wanted to tell you about a couple of additions that have been requested. The first is, and I'll tell you where we're proposing to add them, is under agenda item 3, the secretarial information session. We're adding a report from the Financial Advisory Committee. There are some recommendations for changes that the conference board may want to take action on. Just because it's listed as informational doesn't mean you can't take action. The other one is an update on abundance-based management and halibut bycatch in the US. We're going to take that up under number 7, incidental catch, bycatch. And then also under that agenda item, the issue of preserving, protecting, requesting additional research on nursery or spawning areas that may be beneficial to rebuilding the halibut stock. So that's under 7. And then the last one is under agenda item 8, a question and answer presentation from Deccan Pro on electronic logbooks, which is a US only program right now. I think that's it. Yeah, you guys are all set.
Yeah, just for-
I can look at that later. Okay, so I think we're ready for a motion to approve the agenda with those changes, unless people have something else they want to add to the agenda. Okay,
Yeah, I was just wondering if we could talk about a year-round fishery prior to talking about the fishing periods, opening and closing dates. I wonder if that'd be more useful than waiting till the end of the session.
Okay, so, but you're not talking about year-long fishing for this fishing season coming up.
No,
So it's independent of the opening, closing dates for this year?
Yeah.
Okay, so where should we put
so
it?
why do you want to take it up before we get to regulatory proposals if it's not for the 2025 season?
well, I mean, it could be for the 2025 season, I guess, but I don't know if the appetite's there for it. But if it is, then should we maybe discuss it? I don't know.
Sure,
It's Canada only, so your call.
sure. It's not necessarily all Canada only, but I think I think it would be benefit is to have a general discussion, to just see how much appetite's in the room for a year-long season or whatever from both sides.
Yeah, or even like an extended season, or I don't know, like, it's just,
Okay,
Try
so
and
we'll
get-
take it under the season opening, closing dates.
thank you.
Okay. All right, we still need a motion to adopt the agenda.
I make a motion to adopt the agenda
Sorry, who was that?
as FVOA.
Oh, thank you. There you are. Good.
I'll second it. It's Robert.
Robert?
Okay. Got that? Okay. It'd help us if you're making motions just to say who you're representing and make your motion or representing and the second, just so we capture it for the minutes. The second is Robert.
Yeah, Northern Trollers.
Thank you. Okay, so with that figured out, I guess we go to next. Well, let's go through the
We have-
IPHC secretarial information.
Don't we have to have it voted on?
Any objection to that motion? Okay.
We're good.
Thank you. All right, so we can move into this, well, or do we have to test clickers in case someone?
We have to test clickers, I think,
Yes,
now.
we have to test clickers. All right, over to you. Okay, so then we're ready to go to Dr. Stewart with mortality limits. CY.
Good afternoon. I think I should go straight to questions because you've heard a lot from me already this week. So why don't we just open it up to questions and we'll go from there.
Yes, Dr. Stewart, Dave Grunquist, Coastal Conservation Association, Washington. Can you expand a little bit on the issues in Area 2 as far as, in particular, what the Macaw were talking about this morning, that 1.65 million pounds is a stable fishery for 2A?
I can, yes. And I should have mentioned, I can take questions on the assessment, the projections, the decision table, and since I'm covering for Dr. Webster, I can also take questions on the set line survey while I'm here as well. So we'll cover all those topics. With regard to the question of 2A, I guess the question that's come up is there a specific conservation concern associated with setting a TCEY of 1.65 million pounds? And when this went into place in 2019, we said at that time we saw no conservation concern associated with that. And our primary reference was that we had seen relatively positive trends in all of Region 2. And that at that time, and I think still today, the incremental difference between a slightly lower quota in 2A and a slightly higher quota in 2A, when considered in light of the biological Region 2 resource, which we understand biologically, these fish are mixed across Region 2. We have evidence that fish are moving during the calendar year, even during the fishing season, and moving as far as across all three regulatory areas within a fishing season. And so from that perspective, we still don't identify a significant concern of a modest change in the TCEY within Region 2 as a whole. Noting that where you would make that change is certainly an allocation question. So we're not commenting on that side of things. It would be preferable if we had a strong survey index in all three areas in Region 2. We have currently very good information in 2B and 2C and somewhat weaker information in 2A. We had a small survey in 2A in 2023. And mostly into northern Washington waters. That survey indicated a slight increase from what we had seen in those waters previously. But as I mentioned in the assessment presentation, because of the way the fisheries are prosecuted in 2A, The tribal fishery occurs earlier in the season and in the north part of the area. The non-tribal fishery occurs later in the season and in the more southerly waters off Oregon. And so we really don't have a clear index that is isolated just to 2A. However, I think the staff's biological opinion is that these fish are mixed across the areas. And so we still have the same opinion we've had since 2019, that we don't see a specific conservation concern associated with small changes within area TC-wise within this region.
Phil Wyman, a longliner from Sitka. I was just curious, Dr. Stewart, you mentioned the other day about we were talking about the future year classes, and I was under the assumption that the 14-year class was going to be fairly good, and then you kind of mentioned it wasn't that good looking. Could you kind of elaborate as far as, comparative to like the 12-year class, and just elaborate what you see in your stock conditions for the 14-year class?
I can, yes. And I may have misspoken in one of my presentations. It's actually the 2016 year class that's looking a little bit better than the year classes around it. We were, several years ago now, we were tracking the 2014 year class. The very first time we saw it, it didn't look too bad, but hasn't looked like anything since then. In a nutshell, the recruitment that we've seen since 2005 has all been lower than we were seeing on average up to 2005. So from the mid 90s through 2005, the average recruitment was larger than anything we've seen since 2005. The 2012 and now 16-year classes are maybe right about that average level, but definitely lower than the 2005 year class. And so what that means, we've essentially been fishing off the 2005 year class up until just the last couple of years. That's been the primary productivity that's going into the fishery yield. Now that year class is essentially aged out of the fishery, there's a few of them left, but not nearly as many. We're relying on these two younger year classes, and they're both substantially smaller than the 2005 year class. So that's going to lead to lower yields for the foreseeable future, even if there's another year class coming along behind.
So just one follow-up. So do you think that, you just mentioned that they're going to be lower, but do you think that the 16-year class has anything comparative to the 2005 year class, or is it too early to tell?
At this point, it doesn't look like it, but it is probably too early to be sure. At 8 years old, we generally don't see a lot of 8-year-olds in the fishery or the survey. And this year we saw more 8-year-olds in both of those series than we've seen really since the early 1990s. That if we had seen the trends going up, that would be good news, right? It could be good to see a lot of young fish, but because we saw flat trends at the same time, it tells us that we're not just seeing a bunch of young fish coming in on top of the stock. What we're seeing is we're swapping out older, larger fish for these younger, smaller fish. And so at this point, I wouldn't plan on a change in the estimate of that 2016 year class, but I will grant that at 8 years old, they're pretty young. We don't usually get a solid estimate until they're a little bit older than that.
Thank you, Doctor.
Go ahead, Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm Milne, MPFA. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. So given that information you just provided us about the age class or breakdown of the stock right now, what would that mean for a cut in the TCY this year, like the potential benefits of that?
Yeah, so because both of these year classes are still growing and maturing, they're still relatively young, particularly the 2016 year class. I think we can see in the decision table perhaps a little bit more response than we've seen in previous years in terms of stock trend. It is likely that a small to moderate cut in yield now will turn into more spawning biomass over the next few years than we have seen in recent stock assessments. And the reason for that is because these fish are so young, particularly the 2016 year class. At 8 years old, just a very few of those fish have matured. The rest of them will be maturing over the next, really over the next decade. They're still not quite all mature until they're in their late teens. And so I think that the potential changes in the quota now have a larger effect on these year classes than we've seen perhaps on the 2005 year class, even going back several years, 6 or 8 years.
Thank you.
Chris, did you have a question? Yeah.
Just coming back to the discussion on biological regions. So, a few years ago, it was pointed out to us that there's no biological basis for the regulatory areas, and that's why we started talking about biological regions. That's correct, right?
Yes, unfortunately, when we drew the lines in the water, they forgot to tell the fish.
Okay. Thanks. So you were kind of referring to biological region 2 there when you're talking about fish moving within the biological region, but I assume that applies to all the biological regions?
Yes, so I was referring to some specific tagging experiments that we've done that showed extensive movement within Region 2. We have not done as much satellite tagging farther north to be able to tell you, to give you some great examples of that. But our understanding would be that these fish are capable of moving pretty great distances for the spawning season. And the reason I hesitate to say it would be exactly the same is because, for example, the fish in 3A and 3B don't really have to go that far to get to spawning grounds that we know of. It's possible that some of those fish do move even as far as into the Bering Sea to spawn, which would be a similar degree of migration. But because the major spawning areas are all basically in the central part of the stock in the Gulf of Alaska, although there's certainly some spawning to the south of that, it's somewhat not surprising that fish from as far south as Washington may be going up into southeast Alaska or perhaps even farther to spawn. So slightly different patterns across regions, but yeah, I think your point is that these fish can be moving pretty extensively across areas in other biological regions as well.
Okay, and then one final question. I noticed when we report things on the biological regions, we report mainly the proportion of the biomass in each biological. We don't actually say how much biomass is in that region. And I seem to recall you explaining to us why that was the case before, but I've forgotten it, or maybe you didn't, or I imagined it. Can you just elaborate on that? Thanks.
I can, and you're right. We generally think about a coastwide stock and then proportions in each of the areas rather than breaking that into biomass. And we do that because what we're using to estimate the proportions of the stock in the different regions is our survey information, and it doesn't measure every fish out there. It's dependent on the fish that are selected by the survey, which is 16-aught hooks and traditional longline gear. So it's more difficult to extrapolate that up to the whole to other demographics of the entire stock. The stock assessment itself is still combined across all areas. And so the stock assessment doesn't produce an individual biomass estimate for each area. I realize it's a little bit of a subtle distinction because we do sort of turn that into biomass when we look at things like exploitation rates and other things. But that's the reality is that the stock assessment doesn't model separate fish in each area. It models it as a pool, and then we use the survey as a tool to try to understand what parts of that pool are in different regions.
Go ahead, Forrest.
Thank you, Linda. Dr. Stewart, you responded to a question about the 2016 year class, and you used the phrase small to moderate cuts would preserve that year class or yield dividends. I would maybe say, characterizing your comments. Can you speak to us a little bit about what small to moderate means to you?
Yeah, and this is not my domain. So I guess the reason that I characterized it that way is because in the decision table, I can see some change in the response to, say, the risk of stock decline as you get below the status quo. I think you can start to see the probability of 1 and 3 year stock decline starts to go down perhaps more rapidly below the status quo. And then above the status quo, it's a bit higher. So I wasn't really intending to make a comment on a specific range of cuts, just to note that a cut from the status quo does seem to have a larger effect on the immediate stock trajectory than we may have seen in some other recent stock assessments.
Madam Chair, if I could have a follow-up. So I have the harvest decision table pulled up, and I don't know how easy or not easy that would be to put on our screens, but we kind of got cut short there with public comment and any response from the Secretariat. And so maybe I could get some feedback to this group now on that. and I'll just, maybe folks have it, or I don't know if that can be pulled up, but so I think my closing statement or my closing point was, what do we do with the probabilities that we're getting, the probability on the, Alan's, I forget even what he had those projections going out at 43, F43 and F51. And what do we do with the harvest decision table? And I want to make sure that I am not over investing in the decision table, like putting too much trust in it. Because when I look at it, I'm not seeing some of the, I feel like 10% is sort of where I would like to see us hold. And maybe I'm jumping forward in our conversation, but when I'm looking at that, if I'm looking at stock trend or stock status or fishery trends, I'm seeing a lot of, again, I'd like to turn it around in my head and say, there's a 69% chance that the stock trend will be better in 2026 than 2025, and kind of flipping it around in your head, because at this point, with all of the narrative or all of the things and the concerns we've heard from fishermen on the water, I don't know what to make of this anymore. And it just seems like the probabilities of breaking below that B30 or B20 are pretty consistent across the board, small changes at best for the 20% in stock status. And I'm just wondering why we aren't considering incremental cuts at this point and seeing what it does to the stock short term, so we can kind of, keep pushing forward at economical levels or socioeconomic levels. So I don't know if you can speak to all of that in a response, but.
Yeah, I guess I would just say in response that there's no hard breakpoints in the decision table. There's not really an inflection anywhere where I could say, if you cross this column in the table, something very different happens. There's certainly a smooth transition in probabilities across a range of different management actions. So I realize it doesn't lend itself to pointing to a particular place in the table, but I think that's about all I can say on it.
Question or?
I'm still going like, how am I supposed to use this now? A little bit, but when I look at this, I must see something different, because I see the odds of us doing something catastrophic by just going down 10% are not there. I'm not seeing it in this table. I'm seeing a fair amount of precaution there, but yeah, I'm just trying to learn to use it, I guess. So.
Thanks, Forrest. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, Mark Carell, CDFU. Thanks, Dr. Stewart. My question is in regards to the incomplete utilization of the quota, particularly in the western areas in Alaska. And we saw yesterday during the presentations that, it's as low as 32% in 4 Bravo. And I was just curious, as we consider mortality limits for this coming year, how do we account for that? So if we say, maybe just use the example of 4 Bravo, if we were to take a 10% cut as an example in 4 Bravo, how meaningful is that? And how do we, and also just how does this factor into the decision table, or are we looking at cuts from last year's adopted TCUI, or are we looking at the actual harvest that occurred? And just speak more to that, please.
I can, and thanks for the question. I should clarify that the status quo in this case is the coastwide TCUI that was set for 2024, not the mortality that was removed from the stock. In the stock assessment, we use the actual estimate of mortality. So we're accounting for the fish that were left in the water last year in the results. So in that regard, there's no extra savings to be had in the stock assessment. Those fish that we didn't catch last year are already there in the results from this year. But in terms of thinking, in terms of the projection, when I do the projections forward, I do assume that the sectors are going to catch that the projection is going to be fully caught. And so I guess if one wanted to think, okay, well, we're likely to only catch X% of next year's quota, then you could look at the table and say, well, if starting from the status quo, if you're willing to say only 90% of that's going to be caught, then that actually would move you down effectively to, that puts you a little bit below a 5% cut already. So I think that is one way to think about it. I guess I would caution that, that would be sort of banking on people not catching those fish next year. And I don't know what the conditions may or may not be like and whether that could happen. It's also more than just the directed fishery. So in that projection, we're also assuming that there's an 0.26 bycatch component in there, and we're assuming that that's going to be the 3-year average. If it comes in above that, then that's going to actually lead us to be closer or even above if all the other sectors caught their fish. So that becomes a bit of a management decision about how precautionary to be in terms of what's being projected forward. And the only guidance I've gotten from the commission on that is to assume the 3-year running average bycatch for decisions. But other than that, we assume that the catch sharing plans and everything else, all the other sectors are caught. The only exception to that are things like subsistence and unguided sport fishing, which we assume are going to be unchanged year to year. And those do change, but they don't always go up or down. Those seem to kind of fluctuate. And so far, I haven't identified that that's necessarily a bad assumption to make.
Okay, thank you. Just quick follow-up if I may. So in an area where, say, 10% of the harvest did not happen and we take a 10% cut, is it possible that the coming year, the harvest is actually identical to what it just was?
Yes, and I think that potential is there even for larger than 10% cut, depending on how that cut's distributed across the areas.
Okay, thank you.
So we have Ken and then over there. Ken?
I've noticed that the word risk has been used substantially more this year than in other years. And commercial fishing or fishing is a high risk business. And there's no doubt that we take on risk very easily. And from my perspective, from what I'm hearing and knowing that, there's a need for us to keep our risks in check and to face reality and to actually make a difference in how we set these catch limits. And at times we're looking at tables and in our heads, we're actually getting ourselves not in line with the risks that we're actually feeling ourselves. Because as a commercial fisherman, what it's telling me is by all the risk in that is that risk is so high that we are actually concerned about it. And something needs to be done about it. And I don't know what you've got for comments on that, but Ian, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit. But I just, believe that our risks and the way we look at risk is so high that on a normal thing, that the risks are actually way up there.
Yeah, well, I wasn't on the water this year, so I'm relying on all of you for those observations. But I have tried in the various presentations, I have tried to identify where there are potentially risks that are outside the results of the assessment and the decision table. And the biggest ones of those are the potential for a further revision to the commercial fishery CPUE series. If that happens next year, that's liable to bring the stock assessment results down a little bit. And then the really difficult one to think about is the potential for bias in the survey due to the reduced designs in the last few years. And that's one that we won't have a good idea about until we really have done several more good surveys in the future. So those are risks that are not included in the decision table and in the numbers that I've provided. There are some others as well, but I think those are the two big ones to keep in mind.
That's good timing, Ian, because what I just wanted to say kind of is in tandem with that. Yeah, I mean, it seems like if there's some unknowns, it could be even worse than this. I think sometimes we get caught looking at this table. We act like it's that's as bad as it could be. It could still be worse than that. And I think it's important to remember that in times when the stock is as low as it is, and it could be even more sensitive than ever, that we can't just accept these unknowns and say, that's as bad as it can get, because it could certainly get worse. So.
Chris, and then back over here.
Yeah, thanks. My comments actually kind of build on the last ones. I think that we have to be cautious when we look at the decision table, because even if you look, the fishing intensity interval, the fishing intensity could be anywhere within that interval. So there are risks. And I also think that when we're looking at these numbers, for example, this one's 10%, this one's 9%, it's not a big difference. But actually it is. For example, if you look at like status quo versus status quo minus 15%, for example. Okay, so look at the probability of its being in the stock status below 20%, right? It goes from status quo is 10% down to 8%. That's a 20% difference. That's a big difference. And then the next year it's going from 9 to 6. Now I know these numbers are rounded. That's a 33% difference. And then you're going from 8 to 5. That's my math's not so good. 38% difference, something like that. Those are big differences in terms of how they're relative to each other. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. And I think we have to be taking stuff like that into account when we're looking at this decision table and using it to make decisions. Thanks.
And I just wanted to speak to being cautious about looking at quota that wasn't harvested as possibly being banked, or fish that wasn't taken, and we can add that back in, because I think a very informative graphic that you showed was the skipper sets. We're pretty good at what we do, and if it could be caught, it would be caught typically. And so if it's not getting caught, there's probably a reason that there's just not enough concentration, or they're not there, and maybe we're overestimating certain stocks in certain areas.
Okay, let's remember to keep this to questions for Dr. Stewart. We're going to have time to talk about positions on catch limit. So any other questions? Go ahead, down there.
Yeah, Dr. Stewart, it's Doug Maven. You and I spoke before the session began about your table that showed the impacts of no fishery on the stock. And you had indicated that when you considered fisheries, it's all impacts in fisheries, so trawl and directed commercial and recreational. Are you able to separate those out so that you can give us some idea of how big an impact each gear type has on the resource?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Doug. We can. We actually published a paper a few years ago where we looked at this in the context of bycatch specifically, looking at the relative contribution of each source of mortality to the difference between what we think happened and what might have happened in the absence of fishing. And in that analysis, we found that on average across years, a pound of bycatch would have turned into about 1.15 pounds of directed fishery yield all the way down its lifetime, accounting for the fact that there's smaller fish. We also found that ratio varied substantially over time. It depends on how hard you're fishing the stock. The harder you fish the stock, the more pounds you would have gotten back, because the less opportunity fish would have had to die on their own. And we found that ratio varied from even slightly less than 1 under certain conditions up to about 1.4. But it definitely depends on how hard we're fishing, which sectors are taking how much. So that is an analysis that we've done. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So can I just ask a follow-up would be, would that ratio or relationship change with the abundance of the resource? So if the halibut stocks are in the situation they're in now, would that change, or does it remain constant?
So it could change with the abundance of the resource, but what makes the biggest difference is how hard we're fishing on the resource. And so, to the degree that our fishing mortality rate might actually change, depending on whether the stock goes up or down, that could have an effect.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Bucklakaitis. If there was consensus with the group to kind of have that minimum spawning biomass, like whether you choose 2023 or this year, what's the best tool? Is it this decision table? I mean, how do you solve for that? Like in a practical way, what to give us not assurances, but high risk or high, what would it be? Anti-risk to not go under that kind of, if we were going to explore that concept a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the best way to solve for that?
I can, and you may want to ask Dr. Hicks about this as well, because this sort of bridges the gap between a tactical decision now and a longer term strategy. I think in the tactical decision table, if you were to say use right now the spawning biomass at the beginning of 2024, you can look directly at the probability of decrease in biomass, and that would correspond essentially to that reference point this year. Next year, it's going to get a little more complicated depending on whether the stock goes up or down. I can certainly continue to provide a bridge, a tactical crossover bridge. We could even have a row in the table, which was what's the probability of dropping below, whether it's 2023, 2024 this year, any particular year. I think Dr. Hicks has got some ideas about how that might actually be incorporated into a harvest strategy policy, whether it's a control rule where you automatically reduce the fishing intensity when you drop below that level, or even when you're approaching that level. There's a few ways to do that. I guess I would say that this is probably would be a great topic for the Management Strategy Advisory Board to tackle this year and think about how best to operationalize that for in a strategic sense. But there's lots of ways that we could build something like that, concept like that in.
Hi, thanks. Dr. Stewart, I was looking at the slide 16 on your presentation of presentation 11, and I see that the average weight of the landed fish in 2A is kind of diverging from what the other stocks are doing in other regulatory areas. And I was just curious if it's something to do with like weighted age, or is it a different year class? Are they seeing a lot more smaller fish? Is there a reason why it's kind of just gone down and stayed down? And then if that trend continues, would you run the risk of possibly going into localized depletion if you're harvesting more pieces to get the same poundage out of the water? I'm just curious of that.
Yeah, so to refresh people, I think you're speaking to slide 16, which is the trends in average weight of a landed fish, and identifying that IPHC regulatory area 2A on average lands the smallest or the lightest fish, smallest fish of any, consistently of any of the IPHC regulatory areas up and down the coast. Although it's the actual weights are down now around 15 pounds in regulatory area 2A, I would note that it's not necessarily a divergence in recent years. 2A has consistently had the smallest fish on the coast through this whole time series from the late 1980s. In fact, I have a graph in the longer document that has a longer time series, but I don't recall what 2A looked like prior to that. There's really only about 5 or 6 years in the time series when 2A had larger fish on average than any of the other IPHC regulatory areas. This is slide 16 in presentation 11. Yeah, thanks. And similarly, IPHC regulatory area 2C has consistently been at the top of that in terms of average fish. I think these kinds of patterns tend to reflect consistent demographics in these areas. 2A is essentially at the end of the migratory pipeline, and it consistently has small and young fish, and it pretty much always has. This isn't something new for 2A. On the flip side, when we go out, and I apologize, area 4 is combined on this graph because this is kind of a subset of a longer time series where we can't break it out. But if we look out at 3B particularly, 4B historically, that those fish in 4B tend to be older and larger, and there's a much higher sex ratio of males to females. It's almost 50-50 in 4B. So we do see these consistent patterns generally across biological regions, but I think you've identified here that even within region 2, there's quite a bit of stratification of these fish. But But I don't see it as a recent divergence necessarily. It's just a continuation of a pattern we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, but I mean, just looking at the graph, like you can kind of see we've been going a downward trend in the size of the fish coast wide, but you look at every regulatory area where it's kind of just going along. There's some ups and there's some downs. Even like 2A in the early period is some ups and some downs, but it just seems like it was kind of going along, and then now it's trending downward from about 2016. I'm not saying that's like, I'm just curious, like, are they encountering more smaller fish, or is the size and age issue? Just because it was kind of for about 20 years, 25 years, it's just been relatively flat, and then now it's been trending down. And I'm just curious, like, are they seeing more smaller fish there? Like, what's the age structure? Is it just poor growth, or is there a reason?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I guess I would steer you toward the longer data overview document that's available on the website. That will actually have age composition information that's regulatory area specific. Again, our understanding is that these fish would be mixing. So I think that it's possible that what you're seeing in 2A reflects the overall shift toward more younger, smaller fish in the stock, because 2A has always represented the more younger, smaller fish within Region 2, and to the degree that those fish are even younger now, particularly the 8-year-olds. We've seen some patterns in some other areas as well. You can't see it in this graphic, but we've seen some changes in 4C, D, and E as well, in terms of sex ratio and age composition. But unfortunately, I can't really get to that level of resolution in the larger presentation. So that's going to be in those more detailed documents. But I honestly don't have an answer for why that might be occurring.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious if there was like a year class or something that was coming along that's showing up more in 2A or something. And if not, then would be running into a risk of localized depletion if you're continually encountering small fish and you're having the same constant exploit?
Yeah, I do, without looking at the age comp specifically, I do think that this probably represents these younger year classes. I would suspect that we saw a lot of the 2016 year class in this year, and perhaps the 2012s to a greater degree in recent years. I don't think this is necessarily an indication of localized depletion, just because our tagging work would indicate that these fish are mixing throughout the year. And so what you see in 2A in the summer are the fish that have gone down to 2A in the summer. And they're probably the same fish that were in 2B and 2C early and late in the year.
Okay,
Thank you
let's
very
go,
much.
move on. Chris, did you have a question, another question, or?
Yes, I did actually. No, I
Okay,
just thought of
and
the
then
second one
Gary.
too. Okay, so first question is just for this average weight landed fish, is there a similar graph? And I know there's going to be gaps because some years recently, some areas aren't surveyed, but shows average weight based on survey results, FIS results by area?
Yeah, again, I apologize. It's in that longer document that's on the website.
Okay,
There is a graphic for the survey in there as well. And there's a version of this graphic that has the time series that goes all the way back, I think perhaps even to the 1930s. It goes way back in the time series.
Okay, my mind just blanked out on question number 2. Sorry.
Thanks, Dr. Stewart. I have a question regarding kind of the long time series and how the stock assessment accounts for varying levels of fishing intensity. I mean, trying to get some reinforce, the sense of confidence that I have based on where the stock is now relative to where it's been before. And that, we've been at a similar spawning biomass in the 70s and then went to, peak biomass in the late 90s. But one kind of blind spot, I'm curious how the stock assessment accounts for the fact that there was like very little fishing intensity, prior to the 80s. And I know that maybe 50s and the 80s, from the 50s through the 70s, there was some derby openers out west. But do different models within the stock assessment account for the fact that there was kind of, an untapped resource out there for a long time that might have allowed for more fishing intensity to the east, and that just like natural migration kind of allowed for that increased fishing intensity? Does that make sense?
It does. And maybe if we could jump to slide 34. I'm not sure who's running the screen, but thanks. And one more click and it'll bring up a box. Yeah, thanks. So these are the two long time series models. And you're quite right, Garrett, that as you start to get back before the 1980s, the information content, especially on the west side of the stock, really tapers off fast. So we really don't know. We don't know the effect on the biomass in the west of fishing on the east side of the stock. We know there was a period of time, I mean, even as far back as the early 1900s, when there was a decade where we were taking greater than 60 million pounds out of Region 2 alone. And the question really is, if we think about, sitting down to a meal, was that a straw in one side of a bowl of soup and the whole thing is coming down? Or was it a slice off the side of the cake and the other side of the cake was untouched during that time period? And I think that the reality is probably, sorry about the food analogy, the reality is probably somewhere in between. As we understand the migratory dynamics, we believe that these fish in the west there was still a migration to the east, that probably there was some effect of fishing on the east side of the stock, drawing down the biomass in the west. As when we look at the age data, as the fishery progressed to the west, they weren't just finding an untouched population of old growth halibut. They were encountering fish that were similar in age and size structure to what we see today. So these two models are essentially two different explanations of that process. The black line would be consistent with that biomass being pretty lightly exploited in the west and mostly inaccessible to the fisheries on the east side. And the blue line here, that model would be as if those fish are mixing pretty thoroughly and most of that biomass was available. And so when I look at this graph, I think, well, there's probably somewhere in between the black and the blue series back there in the 1970s is probably where the actual biomass was. And that would lead me to conclude that we are, if not at, or pretty close to the lowest biomass that we've seen compared to that time in the 1970s. Going all the way back to the 1930s, it becomes a little more challenging because the data are pretty limited back there in the 1930s. So I think that first dip, while there's pretty strong evidence the stock was in pretty rough shape right around the time the commission was formed, and for a few years afterwards, it's really difficult to quantify that. So I guess I would focus on the 1970s and say that those two models probably bracket the plausible range.
Okay, thank you. One follow-up. So do all of the models account for estimates of like regional fishing intensity over like this time series, whether the confidence is high or low? I'm just trying to understand if that's accounted for in the estimates, if we're trying to get some confidence moving forward that the fishery went to maximum spawning biomass that we've seen from a level similar to where we are now. It seems like a pretty big area of uncertainty if we basically had this giant halibut savings area out west that was kind of perpetuating higher fishing intensity to the east. So I guess my question is, do all the models incorporate some estimate of regional fishing intensity over the time series?
It's a good question. And there's two parts to the answer, which is the first part is that none of the four stock assessment models are spatially explicit, meaning none of them have separate boxes for different regions and model those fish as different subpopulations within the greater stock, with migration and fishing being separated. These are all for coast-wide models, so we're assuming a common pool of fish. However, the two of the models are aggregated up to the coast-wide level, so they just have a single index, for example, from the survey and a single index from the fishery. The other two models, one long and one short, and that's the black line here, model the fishery and the survey in each of the regions separately. So we're not separating the population, but we're separating the data, which means that we can, for example, in the West, we can take out a different demographic of fish with the fishery than we do in the East. And so as we go back in time, that becomes quite important for exactly that reason, because on the east side of the stock, when you make that assumption, basically you say that the older, larger fish are unavailable to the fisheries at that time because they were occurring in a region that we weren't fishing. And the selectivity in the West includes all the old, large fish. The selectivity in the East doesn't include some of those older, larger fish because they weren't available to those fisheries. So we can approximate that, but it's not quite as good as if we had, a truly spatially explicit model and estimated the rate that fish move among the areas and all the different growth parameters and everything. I don't know if that's kind of a complicated answer, but we try to include a notion of space in these models, but it's not as detailed as it could be.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, it's a good answer, and I know that farther you go back, the data is harder to have your confidence in. I do have a follow-up. So when we're thinking about the decision table, and I think a lot of us were pretty shocked last year after the change was made to the natural mortality estimate, and all of a sudden, it was looking like our kind of target fishing intensity was could go up quite a bit. I'm wondering if any of the four models seem to be kind of obviously not in line with where we currently are. If that, I'd almost like to be able to see the decision table for each model, which is probably not realistic, but I am curious if there is, or if any of the models within the stock assessment appear to be, overly optimistic relative to kind of what we're seeing right now. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think if we could go back to slide 28. So this is the results of each of the four models, and the decision table includes all four. So some of the uncertainty in the decision table is actually uncertainty across these four models. But one of the takeaways here is that there's pretty big spread in biomass estimates at the end of this time series, well, at both ends of the time series, across these four different models. And that's, I think, a pretty good representation of our uncertainty in the dynamics from the stock. This year, the way they stack up, the Areas Fleet's short model is the highest biomass estimate, and the coast-wide short model is the lowest biomass estimate of the four. But one of the benefits of using four models is that these models respond differently as we put data in year to year. I'm sure you've all seen this in this and other stock assessments. You add data, and sometimes the model goes up a little, sometimes it goes down a little. Even in a perfect world, if the stock were completely flat, as we would add data year to year, we would still see the assessment model going up, estimates going up and down. That's just the nature of doing stock assessments. So I would caution against necessarily trying to identify one of these models as more optimistic or pessimistic than the others, because over the last 13 years that I've been doing this assessment, I've seen these models trading places over time. It really depends on how the annual data come in. Sometimes we get a signal in certain regions that will come into two of the models, but not really be as visible in the other models. And then, over time, that kind of dampens its way out because we're essentially taking the average across all four of these models.
Great. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Tom, I think we have, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. I'm wondering, what would the sexual maturity be of these 2-year classes that we're now intercepting, being like 2012 and 2014? What percent of them have now reached sexual maturity? I believed from seeing one of the graphs earlier on today that we're in a pretty steep climb into sexual maturity at this moment. And it just occurs to me that these fish being left in the water might be kind of low-hanging fruit for driving stability in the stock in the coming years. Would you be able to respond to that?
I can, and I apologize. I think last year I had a slide in the presentation deck that actually had the maturity curve and put the year classes on there for you. There's only just so much material I can present in one sitting. That graphic is available on the longer document on the website, but in a general idea, the 2012 year class at 12 years old is going to be a little more than half mature. So something between 50 and 60% of those fish are going to be mature. The 2016 year class at 8 years old, I believe that's going to be single digit maturity as of 2024. So there's a lot more maturation to go of those fish in those 2 year classes. And that certainly leads to a case, and I've mentioned this in the context of the decision table, where catching those fish now may have a slightly larger effect on the trend in spawning biomass over the next couple of years, just because we are counting on these year classes to move into the spawning biomass over the next couple of years, especially the 8-year-olds. Those fish are quite young. Halibut are generally 50% mature between 11 and 12 years old. Now, the one caveat to that is that we are in the middle of an extensive reevaluation of the maturity schedule. We now have 3 years of data collected pretty extensively everywhere we've been surveying. And Dr. Planis's group is currently working up all that information. So we may see somewhat of a change in the maturity schedules in next year's stock assessment once they've processed all that. But I think in a general sense, an 8-year-old is still going to be pretty young relative to the maturity schedule, even under a revised schedule.
Right. Just as a follow-up comment to that, I feel like less intensity on these fish while they mature would just be beneficial for everyone in the room. Would it not be less interception, less weeding through the fish to pull out the ones that are mature and have entered the fishery, and in a fairly short time frame, the remainder of that year class will be mature and contributing into the stock versus taking them out in the next year or two while weeding through what half of them may not be mature yet. Just seems as a little bit just not the wisest thing to do.
Yeah, certainly there's an effect of harvesting these fish at a younger age and smaller size. There will be more yield per fish in a few years from these year classes as there are now.
Mark.
Mark Carell, CDFU. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. So I did a little retrospective analysis looking back at the decision tables and the stock assessments of last year and the year before. And correct me if my numbers are wrong, but if I read the stock assessments right, our estimated spawning biomass dropped about 15% from last year to this year. Is that correct?
It's actually 17%.
17. Okay, thank you. And then the year before, so from 23 to 24, it looks like maybe about 11% or something in that ballpark. Okay, so then looking back at the decision tables from those 2 years. So last year when we were in Anchorage, we opted for about a 5% coastwide cut. And when I look in the decision table from last year, the probability of a greater than 5% drop in spawning biomass, which is indeed what occurred, in fact, triple that, with like a 17% drop. The probability there was about 9% given our 5% cut. And then if I look at the harvest decision table from 2 years ago when we were in Victoria, we took a 10% coastwide cut. And that should have put our probability of a greater than 5% drop in spawning biomass at 7%. So can you help us understand what happened?
Yeah, I can. And thanks for going back and doing the homework for me. So there's a couple things there. The first is that the decision table is conditioned on the data that we have right now. And so, for example, if I come back next year and I redo the stock assessment, but the 2024 fishery CPUE, for example, is lower than it is now, that's going to change these probabilities, but it's not included in this year's decision table. So in that regard, these probabilities are only as good as the current inputs that we have. And a large portion of what you're identifying is an actual change in the underlying information that's going into the decision table. So in that regard, we're never going to capture that kind of a pattern with the decision table. On the other extreme, we get, or not extreme, but the other part of this is, what does it mean if we have, say, a 30% chance of stock decline, and then we actually see the stock decline? That doesn't mean that it was wrong to think there was a 30% chance. It just means that that happened. It may not have been a likely outcome. And in fact, what we've seen in the last few years is a series of relatively unlikely outcomes in the form of this continued low productivity. And you see that this is sort of manifest in the results that you see from Dr. Hicks, because you see his projections go up quite rapidly. And that's because we are essentially at a low weighted age and a low recruitment. And moving forward, there's a high probability that one or both of those is going to go up. So I guess I think that the probabilities in the decision table are really only valid for this year's decision making. And as soon as we get new information, those are going to be updated. And so this year's table is the new best estimate of that. But there have certainly been changes from over the last few years.
Thank you. A quick follow up to that. So in light of that, does this change our? We've been kicking around this question of is this period of low productivity that we're in now, is this kind of equivalent to the period of low productivity that we saw in the 60s and 70s? Or is something going on that's new and different? And are we actually in a different era of low productivity that's potentially a lot more hazardous and risky to be in, given how the stock is responding to the risk tables like that? Thank you.
That's the question, and I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. I've tried to outline that we are at a point where there's new uncertainty here, and particularly with regard to the environmental conditions, I really have no idea how things have changed and whether or not historical relationships with environmental variables may or may not continue to hold up in the future.
Okay, Jim and I are each going to break in with a question, and then we'll go to Tom and back to Forrest. So,
And Russell.
Oh, and Russell, boy. Sorry, Ian. I have a question for you on thinking about our next action, which is setting season limits. We used to hear consistently that the IPHC didn't want us to fish on spawning stocks. We have extended the season to be putting pressure on those stocks during the spawning period. I think what I've heard from you is it's okay because you can adjust the SPR, but I guess it would help me to better understand what that means. When you adjust the SPR, does that mean you are lowering your expectations of spawner per recruit? I mean, is that the way, or just like, what does that adjustment mean to account for putting pressure on spawning stocks, and what kind of, is there a benefit to the stocks in your perspective of not putting that pressure on?
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot to unpack in that question. I guess I'd start with, in general, if we are counting on a fish to spawn this year before we catch it, we're harvesting too hard. That's something that you run into with herring or mackerel or something with squid with really high turnover, where you want them to spawn and then you catch them and you're counting on that reproductive output. For a longer lived species like halibut, that would be a dangerous fishing intensity to be at in the first place. That said, we really don't have experience with fishing in the wintertime in terms of its potential biological effects. So there is the potential for disruption of the spawning activity. I think that's been documented maybe for cod and some other species. I can't say that that's a risk for Pacific halibut. There are broadcast spawner. It seems unlikely that we would be fishing extensively enough on every spawning aggregation to harm the spawning event by disruption. But since we've never done it, I guess I can't rule it out. In terms of making adjustments to account for that, I believe that the original basis for the spawning closure, this winter closure, was during a time period when the fishery wasn't controlled by overall mortality limits. It was controlled by essentially effort input. And so by closing the fishery in the winter, they were actually hoping to reduce the mortality on the stock. The way the fishery is managed now, we're specifying the mortality, and it's really a question of when that mortality is going to occur. So to the degree that we catch the same number in pounds of fish that we would in a shorter or a longer season, there isn't necessarily a direct biological feedback there. If we're taking the same pounds out this year, which month we take them in really shouldn't have that big of an effect. There are other effects on monitoring and management and other things, but I'll leave those alone.
I think this is probably the easiest one that you're going to have today. So a few years ago, when we started seeing, the 5-year-olds show up in the age structure, your comments back then it's probably a combination of a higher abundance, but also maybe higher growth rates at the younger ages. So looking at, these 8-year-olds are now showing up, more so than they were in the fishery a few years ago. I would assume that's the same conditions, or still it could be a combination of not just abundance, but actually a larger size at age.
Thanks. And that might actually be the easiest question I've gotten today. If we could go back to slide 15, please. Yeah, I just want to note that the bottom line there, the green, are the 8-year-olds. And if you just trace that back across the graph, you can see that our 8-year-olds right now, for the last few years, really are basically as big as 8-year-olds have ever been in this stock. So I think, getting to your point, we could be seeing more 8-year-olds because they are growing a little bit faster. Both the males and the females. I would expect very few males at age 8 to be above the minimum size limit, but I think that is definitely a component in why we're seeing more young fish. It's difficult, though, to separate that out with also the loss of the older fish and shift to younger year classes.
Tom, and then Forrest, and then Russell.
All right, Tom Marking. I guess I'm going to propose a heresy here. I think we're being way too overreactive on the numbers. If you look at slide 18, which gives the last 12 to 13 years.
So Tom, do you have a question? Because let's try to keep it
Yeah,
to questions.
I do. And it's a backdrop on it, though. If you look at these columns of numbers, the average is about 39 million pounds. We're being so reactive, whether we're up 4 million, down 4 million, down 5 million. Dr. Stewart, what would your reaction be if we were proposed to take the average of those two columns of numbers, which is 39 million pounds, which we just oscillate around that number for the last 12 years, and say for the next 3 years, the triennial period of assessments, we just set it at 39 million pounds and leave it be and see how it works out? How would you react to that?
I'd be glad I didn't have to make the decision. I would direct you to the decision table and just look where 39 million pounds puts us. It is off the top of my head, I don't know the probability of stock decline.
It's about 44 SPR, but we never catch that. We'll probably be fishing more like 46 to 47 SPR. And Dr. Hicks's information shows that we can perpetually fish at that. I guess I have more faith in the MSAB process, having done it for 12 years, than this other group does. But I think we're being way too reactive on these numbers. We need to, our whole goal there is to smooth things out to stop a lot of variability. So let's select the number and sit on it for a little while and stop ping-ponging up and down these numbers. And and let it ride for a while to see what happens. I think that's a safe number.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Let's try and keep it to questions. I think Russell is next.
My question is about the size of age, and the history of that. Right now, we've been at a fairly low size of age, and then it increased a little bit. So can we hope to see where we saw that increase and it flattened off on the 8-year-olds? Is that indicating that as those 8-year-olds grow older, they'll keep being a bigger size? And we'll see that higher size at age at the 12 and 15 and of these same ones. And also looking back in the historical record, how variable has the size of age been pre the late 80s peaks?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Russell. I don't know going forward. Because we don't really understand the mechanism driving size at age, whether it's competition or density dependence or environment, I'm reluctant to speculate on where it might be going. But I can definitely say that up until this year, we had seen pretty clear increasing trends, and it did appear to start with the youngest fish, and as those fish got older, work its way up through. I think that would suggest that there's some component of size at age that is either set or restricted at an earlier age and does continue on through the lifetime of that fish. It may be that we're going to see continued increase for some of these age classes, but the data this year didn't show the same trend that we've seen for the last few years. So I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, this was a lot better 4 questions ago with Mark's comments, and it was just, yeah, you had acknowledged that there was a 17% drop, but I thought in a couple meetings ago when you did something for the CV that you had said that it was a reconditioning that caused that drop for the most part, and there was actually an increase from either 23 to 24 of 3%. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on there. So when I say a 17% drop, I'm talking about the difference in the 2024 estimate from last year's stock assessment to the 2024 estimate from this year's stock assessment. So the end of the time series scaled down by 17%. But we are estimating with this 2016 year class starting into the spawning biomass, this year's assessment estimates that the 2025 spawning biomass is approximately 3% larger than the 2024 estimate. So it's actually turned up slightly at the end of the time series.
Okay, so was I talking apples and oranges then? It wasn't a hindcasting of a new understanding. We actually did drop 17, but then going from 24 to 25, you think that we're going up? Sorry to belabor that. I think it was critical in my thinking, and maybe I misunderstood.
This is an important point, and I appreciate you bringing it up. If we could go to slide 29. So the dark blue line that's just below the red points at the end, the red points are the terminal estimate from each of the previous stock assessments. And so you're not off base in saying that when we added the new data this year, including the revised data from last year, it scaled the end of the time series downward. So we still had essentially the same flat trend over the last couple of years that we had, but it would occur at a lower spawning biomass. And now at the end of the time series, that's actually coming up just slightly. It's a little hard to see in this graph. So no, I don't think you're off by saying this was, I wouldn't call it a reconditioning, but it was an updating of the data sources that we had compared to last year's stock assessment.
Okay, I don't see any other hands. I just go one more and then give you a minute. But I think this is also an opportunity to ask questions on the FIS. So if you have those in the back of your mind, you go ahead, then we'll take those.
Hey, Ben Cameron, FAS Seafoods. I was going to ask questions about the TCEY distribution maps. I was just looking at the 2022 to 2024 estimations, and we're seeing a decrease in 3A, which is by proportion making the other regions see an increase in their TCEY distribution. You know, just kind of logically for me, if there's competition for food, and we're talk about a very mobile population of fish. They would move to this new area that would have a greater abundance of food per fish, and we're kind of not seeing that trend in the last 3 years. You'd think as one region's population of predators decreases, more of those halibut would, halibut being the predator, would move into that region 3. Is there some, I mean, I have my own kind of biases about the kind of slightly less monitored trawl fishery in that region, but is there some reason that the models can, or you've seen for why fish might, or are you predicting fish might start moving into region 3, given that its population that it's been supporting for years is decreasing? Do you see a reason for why there might be fish returning to that area to kind of more balance what our previous understanding of the TCEY distribution would be? Or do you think there's specific reasons that region's population is decreasing disproportionately to the other regions?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there's a lot of factors that are leading to the current stock, the current and historical stock distribution, and it's more than just fish movement. So the stock distribution is going to respond to fish directly migrating from region to region, but it's also going to respond to trends in size at age. So to the degree that we've seen larger size at age on the east side of the stock, that's going to lead to more of the biomass there. It also responds to trends in exploitation rates. And so we've had, and all of these things are happening simultaneously. So it's hard to say which is the most important, but we've certainly seen changes in the relative harvest rates of these regions over the last 15 to 20 years as well. And so I think all of those things together have led to this shift in stock distribution. We don't have stock distribution estimates that go back before the 1990s, but just based on the distribution of catch, if we look back over the 100-year period, it suggests that this is a pretty dynamic stock, that the stock distribution has probably shifted back and forth across region 2 to region 3 several times over history. And so it's also dependent on where the recruitments occur, because those fish aren't all going to move. And so there are all these factors that are operating together beyond just direct fish transiting between the areas.
Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Stewart? All right, thanks so much. Do we have Alan, Dr. Hicks available? Oh, there he is in the corner. Great. Okay, so we have Dr. Hicks joining us. We have MSE update on the agenda. I think you probably feel like you've talked to it a fair bit. If you want to hit any high points before we open it up to questions, that would be great. Or you can just take questions, whatever you feel.
Yeah, I'll summarize a little bit, just so y'all can hear my voice again. That was quite a long session on the MSE stuff this morning. Lots of great questions from the commissioners. There's basically really a few concepts that I was presenting, and there were a lot of details in there. The first concept was the objectives. And the MSAB did a lot of work this year on objectives and updating 2 of those objectives, while updating one objective, and that's the maximize yield, and trying to evaluate that as a trade-off with the interannual variability in yield. So looking for stability in the TCEY, but also maximizing the TCEY. The second objective was discussing what benefits the relative spawning biomass of B36%, which is an MEY proxy or maximum economic yield proxy, versus an absolute spawning biomass objective, and whether or not we should be adding an absolute spawning biomass objective into the harvest strategy policy and use that for MSC type analyses. So the absolute spawning biomass objective seems to be of interest here. If you heard a few testimonies on that at this meeting, and where that is really stemming from is it seems like there's a concern about where the stock is. That is a concern that has, related to low catch rates, which can be a low number of fish out there, but the stock assessment's also estimating the spawning biomass to be low. So having some sort of absolute spawning biomass is sort of a proxy for saying we would just like to have a fishery that has higher catch rates and is potentially economically more reasonable than it has been in the last few years. So those were two. If you want to, I don't have control over the slides, do I? If you want to bring up, or whoever brings up slide or presentation 12, and there's a summary slide on the objectives. Yeah, I can't remember which one it is. I should probably just look on my computer, and then I could tell you exactly which one it is. Yeah, let's go. So those are the current priority objectives. If you go about 4 slides ahead, I think it was one more, that one. So this is the summary of the outcomes of these objectives, noting that the changes in red on the right are potential changes we were recommending to the commission to consider. So that's an important concept in the sense of how do we evaluate management procedures. This can lead to developing a management procedure that, say, backs off fishing intensity when the spawning biomass is low. And if you think about the commission's actions in the last 3 years, that's pretty much what they've been doing. They've been operating on a control rule that says, oh, when the spawning biomass is low, let's reduce the fishing intensity. We could actually make that into a more formalized procedure. It says, let's say the spawning biomass is 1.5 times what we saw it was in 2023. I don't think anybody or many people didn't like where we were in 2023. So let's just slowly back off fishing intensity as a control rule instead of, or in place of, or in addition to this 30-20 control rule that we currently have in place. That could be work considered for 2025. And then if you go ahead a couple of slides, please, to the FIS, that one there. We discussed this morning FIS designs, and we evaluated 3 different designs, starting from our current sort of idea of this base block design and then reducing it from there. And if you go to the next slide, the results of that were, as you reduce the design, get more uncertainty in the FIS. In general, the TCY will be lower, and in general, the variability, the change from year to year will be higher. So that's probably not a great thing, but there's a lot of other concepts to balance that with. If you go to the next slide, please. These were results of some of the evaluations with the MSC we did, looking at an annual assessment, a triennial assessment, and different fishing intensity values. And the MSAB took a look at this and thought, a 46% SPR, and let's try out the triennial stock assessment frequency and see how that works. They didn't want to commit to it in the long term, but I think it's a great idea to try it out. And I think the commissioners had the idea of potentially doing them in tandem, in parallel for a little while to see how it works. So, and then if you want to go to, I think it's the third to last slide. If you stop here, this is new stuff in the MSC Explorer that would be fun for people to have a look at. There's the trace plots, but this harvest strategy policy table is organized. The columns are organized exactly as the decision table is. So you get to see what are the long-term strategy type results related to the different SPR values associated with the decision table. And then 2 more slides forward. Actually 1 more and 1 more. So this is related to the harvest strategy policy document. So actually documenting how we do management at IPHC, and that draft document's document 17 on the annual meeting website. But just know that in 2025, there's going to be a little bit of work done on the harvest strategy policy, potentially adopting it at a special session by the commission sometime in 2025. So that's a real brief overview of a 25, 30-minute presentation I gave this morning.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Thanks, Alan. I just wanted to double check my understanding of, I guess, what you said and what we anticipate for the process. It sounded like you said in 2025, we could maybe shift over to the minimum spawning biomass instead of the relative. But you meant that as part of what's on the screen now, that the approval of a harvest strategy. You didn't mean at this meeting the commissioners would switch over to using that. Okay.
Yeah, so at this meet, the commissioners have indicated at the interim meeting, they're not ready to really adopt the harvest strategy policy document at this time. They want to do a little bit more work on it, which is fine. We could introduce the absolute spawning biomass as an objective into this harvest strategy policy. And then I think along with the MSAB is to do a little bit of work investigating what's the response when spawning biomass is low. Should we be reducing fishing intensity? Should we formalize that as a procedure? What the commission has been doing in these last few years, should we formalize that as a control rule, you might say, instead of the relative spawning biomass or in conjunction with it?
And then just a quick follow-up. At one of the previous meetings, there was some discussion about low productivity and whether it was or was not incorporated into either the stock assessment or the MSE. And I didn't catch what exactly was referenced, but can you speak to the state of low productivity or the assumption of low productivity? Where is it, or is it incorporated into anything right now? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So the MSE simulations are projecting quite a ways into the future. And as Dr. Stewart noted, like in the stock assessment, the projections are only 3 years, because then you start making up fish. You start making electronic fish because you're guessing at what recruitment would be. The MSE simulations, we're projecting into that period where we're guessing what things might be, and what we call instead is uncertainty in what it might be. So we don't know in 4, 5, 10, 60 years if we're going to be in a high or a low productivity regime. So we simulate forward with using our best understanding of how the regimes operate. And so the low and the high regimes are both in the MSE results. And that's why the uncertainty is so large, is that in 10 years, we might be in a low regime, but we also might be in a high regime. We just don't know. So we have to integrate over that entire uncertainty. What we've done in the past, and some MSAB members are also very interested in continuing, is we've done some simulations assuming that recruitment is low on average for the next 60 years. And then we've done those same simulations assuming recruitment's high on average for the next 60 years. Then we can compare those as two scenarios, and we can see, okay, if we're always in a low productivity regime, what are our expectations, right? And we can look at short-term and long-term results. But what you'll find is that the outcomes, the TCYs are quite different between those two regimes, as you would expect if you're not getting a lot of recruitment versus you are getting more recruitment. So I have a brochure, which I'll put out at the poster session tonight, that shows those results. It's very similar to the poster we presented last year. But I think the commission and the MSAB could direct a little bit more investigation into that to understand, if we remained in this low productivity regime for, say, the next 10 years, what could things look like?
Chris, did you have more questions?
Yeah, it was just, you sort of touched on it there. Could you go up to slide 19? Yeah. So it was just, it's sort of tying into the question about low productivity, high productivity. And I think what we have to keep in mind is that when we look at these graphs, make sure everyone recognizes, as Dr. Hicks has pointed out, is that right now the stock assessments, we're in a low productivity regime. For those immediate term decisions, the tactical decisions, we're in low productivity, so low weighted age, low recruitment. When we look here over the long term, it's kind of what I guess average or normal productivity, what we think it would be. And so there's a bit of a disconnect there. And I think what Dr. Hicks is suggesting, that we could look at, what if we were able to set a scenario where it's a low productivity regime and use that going forward? Simply because if you think about it, the last couple of years, we've made decisions. We've agreed at SPR 51, but we really didn't know, and we still don't know, and we don't know this year. What does that mean for the future? Was that enough of a cut? Was that too much of a cut? We don't know. And I think, I've been on the MSEP since day one, as others in this room have been. And I think that's where the real value could be in the MSEP going forward in the MSE process. And so I really think if we could pursue what you're talking about there, Dr. Hicks, in that being able to, let's calibrate the operating model so it matches with the stock assessment, and then be able to say, okay, the scenario is normal productivity, and you do both, like the size of age thing and this recruitment, and then the low productivity. And then I think it would help us say, okay, look, if we decide this today, this is the trajectory it takes us on. And that's what I think is really missing in our decision making. It's not going to change the process. We're still going to come here, commissioners are still going to make a decision, but we'll all have better information, not just what Dr. Stewart can tell us because of the 3 years and he doesn't want to go beyond that for paperfish, but it can give us a sense of we're moving in the right direction or we're moving in the wrong direction and how to correct for that. Because one thing just on the absolute spawning biomass, I don't support that. I don't think it's a good idea to have a reference point on that. It's my view. But I think what we need to do is we focus a lot on where we don't want to be. We need to focus on where we want to be and how to get there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for that, Chris. I have a question for you, Alan. On the last slide, you indicated there was, this is an easy question, a workshop coming up, a special session. Are those things that the commissioners have committed to doing, or are those things we're still from the MSAB recommending that they do, and as they move towards a harvest policy?
Yeah, sure. That's slide 24. Yeah, and that's the next steps. I would say at the interim meeting, the commissioners showed a high interest in doing this. And at this meeting, we're hoping they commit to deciding on, or directing the Secretariat to organize those workshops as well as that special session in 2025. Personally, I feel that it will happen. There seems to be a lot of interest in it.
Okay, if I could ask one follow-up on that. And your understanding is they will look at the overall harvest policy, they will look at codifying what they've been doing in the last few years in the absence of a real harvest policy of being below the SPR reference point. What's your...
The idea is to adopt the harvest strategy policy that's the draft right now, which doesn't really, it allows the flexibility of the commission to make decisions as they see fit to account for other factors like socioeconomic factors. So a lot of that is written into this draft harvest strategy policy. I don't foresee a lot of potential changes being put into it at this time, because what we would want to do for some really big changes, like adding in what have they been reducing fishing intensity in the last 3 years, or identifying a new control role, that should take a little bit of work. We should do a little bit of evaluation of that with the MSE process. Adding in a new objective, that's the commission's, they can easily do that. That's their purview, because an objective is an objective. But then to develop a new management procedure, we'd want to make sure we do the simulations. We simulation test it before they introduce that, which we did in 2024. but we haven't investigated any new types of control rules or anything like that. So we'd want to go through the MSAB process. And then I don't think it's a problem to then update the harvest strategy policy in the future when the commission has done the testing and the agreement on updating it. So, you know, if we adopt it with a reference SPR 43%, and then at the next annual meeting, the commission says, no, we do want to reference SPR 46%, that would be, a simple adjustment to the harvest strategy policy. So you can think of it, I wouldn't say it's a living document, but it's a document that can reflect the management, the framework of management at the Halibut Commission. You just don't want to change that framework without good justification.
Okay, I guess I'm trying to understand where the conference board can be helpful to the commission in this process right now. And it sounds like we could recommend they actually go ahead and do this, hold these workshops and the special session, that they do adopt a harvest policy, the draft harvest policy, or that they dropped it and we are suggesting they also add some additional objectives for a longer term study. That's sort of in the realm of what you would be looking for from the conference board commission.
If the conference board wants to get there, I know you have a big task with mortality limits this week also. But if you have the time and you want to look over, if you go to the next slide in this presentation, is the recommendations. There's a number of recommendations there we're hoping the commission consider. And supporting any of those recommendations as the conference board sees fit would be helpful to this process. And the major ones are, updating the objectives and potentially how the conference board sees a reference TCY being determined, whether they would like to see the reference TCY at 46%, recognizing the commission has the purview to make the decision to depart from that reference.
Got it. Thanks. Chris, did you have something else on this or?
It's actually kind of the same question you had, like, what exactly are they talking about at this meeting? What is, we've read the harvest policy. What's missing? Like, what are they looking to change? I think you clarified that. So I'm still a little fuzzy on it as to what they want to talk about there, but I think that's probably the best we're going to get right now. So no, I think you covered my question there, Linda. Thanks.
Okay, anyone else? All right, well, can we keep it to a short break and then come back and take the FAQ? No? Oh, I thought we were going till 5:30. Okay, never mind, you don't get a break. We're gonna go till 5. Because our agenda says 5:30. Oh, we're doing it at 5. Okay. Okay, well then I guess the other topics is the report from the FAQ. And is that, you want to cover that? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. So as you might know, as a part of the IPHC annual meeting series of meetings, so we do start on Monday morning with a financial committee meeting, finance and administration committee. And the report from that meeting has been just published today. And we wanted to draw your attention to a couple of paragraphs that are particularly important to the conference board because they might impact how the conference board will be potentially moving forward. So if we could bring specifically the request 01, it should be in the front section. Just on top, request 01. Not recommendation request, just.
It was just right there.
Yeah.
You were talking about paragraph 28.
This is not working. This is not the right mouse you gave me. Okay. This one, the request 01 that is highlighted here. So as you might see, the FAC requested that the Secretariat evaluate the following potential options for cost savings that could be considered for FY 2026 and 2027 budgets, recognizing that FIS funding shortfall and prudent fiscal management might warrant departures from past IPHC practices. And there were a couple of options suggested that potentially warrant recommendations or at least comments from the conference board. A, options for restructuring future annual meetings to accomplish necessary business in 3 or 4 days rather than 5 days. Options for restructuring the conference board and processor advisory board into a single subsidiary body that could reduce meeting space rental requirement and costs, including associated technology, support rental, secretariat staff support need, minimum charges by hotel for food and beverage, and engaging a team of members of the CB and PAP to advise the Commission on a potential new structure that would ensure both processors and harvesters' perspectives are fairly represented and conveyed to the Commission. C, options for using more economical venues for future annual meetings. D, any other potential cost savings the Secretary might identify for future annual meetings. So I believe you might be interested in addressing particularly A and B. Thank you.
Okay, any thoughts on this? Let's start with A of restructuring future annual meetings to accomplish necessary business in 3 or 4 days rather than 5. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I'd actually like to talk about A in relation to B. I could see B causing a little bit more discussion. I think when you get 2 groups in the room, right now we got 2 groups, now we'd have 4 groups in the room. I could see a lot more conflicting viewpoints, a lot more circling back. I think we kind of go past, what the times are on the agenda. I don't really see reducing the amount of days as being possible if we combine our bodies and muddy the waters.
Chris, did you have a comment on this? No. So maybe I could just go back to you for Brian. So are you saying that would you be okay with combining the bodies if they stuck to 5 days? Or are you saying sort of opposing both these ideas? I was just trying to understand where you were.
At first, I was just thinking that A doesn't seem very likely if we go down the B route, but I'm not really a fan of B to begin with.
Let's see, is that Mark? Oh, and then,
Sure, I would just say it'd be helpful to see actual sort of cost savings estimates for these options, because to me, it seems like options A and B are pretty dramatic. That to me, the meeting feels pretty tight already on schedule, and to try to take a day out of it would, I think, be a pretty drastic solution. And I feel that way about option B. To me, like trying to bring even more people into this room seems like it would make this process a lot harder. For me, option C seems very doable. I certainly wouldn't mind being in a simpler, cheaper space. It'd be fine.
go ahead.
Thanks. To the chair. Yeah, I think we would be echoing the same sentiments for A and B. I mean, maybe, this year, last year, the conference board and the PAB might be in an alignment. That really can't be guaranteed for other years. And I don't think it's quite effective when our interests might be diverging. So really don't support something like that. But truly and honestly, I think from an administrative standpoint, option C, really trying to see what is more economical as you can project in the, next couple of years. Meeting locations might be the quickest way to achieve some cost savings, especially depending on, again, I don't know where the next one's going to be, but if we can look at those options, that might be more economical, especially for those that are traveling much long distances, and having that kind of availability. So appreciate looking at C in more detail.
Okay, Chris?
Sort of echoing what we've heard so far, like, I'm not sure how B, when you're going to have 2 different interests, trying to get them together, and somehow that's going to lead to efficiency and less meeting time. I think it's going to have the opposite effect, as was pointed out. I'm not sure what is the problem with the current process, aside from obviously there's concerns about having 2 meeting rooms instead of 1. Not sure about the food. I know we got water, but anyway. I guess my point is that right now the presentation is done, in an open and transparent manner. The reports are given, everyone's there, the commission, everyone hears it. So I'm not sure, I don't see a flaw in the current process. And then I guess if we're talking about more economical venues, and no disrespect to anybody or any location, but then why are we taking MSAB to Juneau? I'm just saying. I'm just saying, if we're really looking at cutting costs, and it's not just the annual meeting, and maybe the finance committee did this already, and I wasn't there, but I don't have a problem with economical venues for future annual meetings, whatever that is, whether it's we meet in Bellingham, or we were in that Everett that one year, that centrally located place that wasn't next to anywhere, it was, yeah, or wherever it was. But I'm just saying that's true. But then let's look at the whole gamut of it and make sure this plays out. But I don't see how this is going to lead to efficiency or improve the decision-making process. The decision-making process, I think it's streamlined as it can be now, and it's open and transparent.
Okay, any other comments? One thing I would just ask people to think about, right now, we start at 12:30 on that first day. And I think the commissioners do meet in the morning, but that's their call. And we tend to wrap up that 5th day partway through the day, right? So, that is one way you could cut it back, starting in the morning and finishing the end of the 4th day. So just for people to think about for a minute.
Yeah, so similar, the starting at, middle of the day on the Monday. I think if we could, there's some, the commissioners have their stuff they need to do. Okay, that's fine. If that can't change, but at least why can't the conference board of the PEG start and deal with some of the more housekeeping issues, regulatory proposals, opening and closing dates, something like that, so that we're partly, we get a part start, then we hear the president how they want to do it, then we go back, and then we're not, this half day isn't sort of just either people are traveling here or I'm doing other work in my room that has nothing to do with the IPHC stuff. So I think if we could really sort of talk about that, I think it would be good.
Okay, so I'm getting that people are generally opposed to combining the conference board and the PAB. I don't see anybody saying they think that's a good idea, unless Robert, you're okay. And then still some discussion around whether there's a way to shorten it by starting first thing in the morning. Either the annual meeting starts then with the commissioners, or possibly the conference board, PAB, if they want to, can start in the morning with some of this, the kind of stuff we've done this afternoon, break, and then come back. Okay, any more discussion? Go ahead, Robert.
Just with options for using more economical venue for future annual meetings, the most economical would be to do it all online, and I don't think that would be the best way to do it. So I just like to make a note that I can't speak for everybody else, but for myself, I prefer to be in person. So if they're trying to look at venues that are economical, to trying to avoid an online meeting for 4 or 5 days is pretty hard.
Okay, I'm going to say that Simeon is saying online, if it works, don't fix it. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I'm not sure it really works. I'm for streamlining this process, and I agree. We start at 12 o'clock. I'm not here on vacation. I'd just soon do. This might sound extreme to some, but I'd just soon do 2 12-hour days and let's get out of here. I got things to do. But yeah, I don't think you got to rip the whole thing out by the roots. But hey, if we can figure out how to streamline this a little bit better and get better use of our time while we're here, and cut a day and a half off, listen, that's a great idea. So
would anybody object to the conference board at least starting, 9 o'clock Monday morning, 8 o'clock Monday morning? Is that something that we can support to the commission? Okay. All right. Oppose putting the two together, but go ahead, Forrest.
I just wondered if it doesn't save a hotel night, I don't think, because I mean, most people are flying in Monday, and so then you'd fly in Sunday and have a Sunday night if the schedule was the same. I'm not sure there's savings there. I'm not opposed to, I don't want to be here any more than the next person, but
I think the thinking would be it may help get to a 4-day meeting instead of a 5-day meeting. But I'm not sure. Someone would have to, the commissioners would also have to figure out how they shorten their meetings by half a day. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, two things. So I think that I don't have a problem starting earlier at the beginning of a day. I do think there's a lot of value in conference board members being able to hear the presentations that are given to the commissioners and hearing the commissioners' questions and dialogue. I think that helps this process in this room be more efficient. So again, not opposed to starting at the beginning of a day, but I think consideration should be given to making sure that there's that opportunity. And then my second comment, as I'm reading this, it says the FAC requested that the Secretariat evaluate these things. So we can definitely voice our opposition, but if this does get traction, I am interested in being on the group of conference board members that would discuss option B if it gets traction. So I'm just putting that out there if it goes that direction. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it seems like I certainly take your point that we wouldn't want to bring Ian in here and have us ask all the questions, if we hadn't heard the presentation. But we could go through getting everybody accredited, making sure the voting system is working. Some of that kind of housekeeping we could do, it seems like, without much loss to the process. Kathy Hansen has her hand up online. Let's see if we can hear Kathy. Go ahead, Kathy.
Can you hear me now?
We got you. Go ahead.
So I would like to see, when I first started coming to the IPHC meetings, you started out first thing Monday morning with the presentations with staff and commissioners, and it was pretty much finished up by the end of the first day. And then the second day, you started immediately into the conference board. If you went back to that kind of system, it's very possible you could maybe squeeze down into 4 days and let the commissioners maybe be, 4.5 days by doing their finance committee at a, different time rather than doing that the first part of the first day. You definitely need the presentations before the conference board gets together, unless you do, like you said, just the very simple housekeeping parts of it. But I don't think the two should be combined, the conference board and the processor advisory board. And when I read B, I read in between the lines back to several years ago when they were trying to reduce the number of participants on both the PAB and the conference board by a significant amount. And I just don't support that type of idea at all. Those are my comments.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. I mean, I think we gave them pretty clear response on that, that we feel like this is an important process that increases engagement generally and gets more perspectives, and we didn't want to see the conference board representation reduced, and maybe we need to reiterate that. So we have one more person online. I think it's someone who was not here when we went through roll call, but let's give Dave a chance to weigh in.
So I will remind, this is organization that was seeking new accreditation.
Yeah.
So it's up to you whether you would like to.
Well, we can give him a chance to speak, at least as a guest, since we haven't gone through accreditation, but we're not getting.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure. We'll give you a chance to make a comment.
Okay. Hello, folks. My name's Dave Johnson. I'm the president of Puget Sound Anglers Ocean Chapter and a vice president of the state. I'm also the Washington State Sport Representative on the Pacific Fisheries Management Council for the last 10 years. And would like to get more involved with the IPHC.
Okay, thanks for joining us. We sort of wrapped up our accreditation process a while ago, but I think you're seeking accreditation to join the conference board. Is that right, Dave?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, people have any other questions for Dave? You represent harvesters, is that correct?
Yes, the sport anglers of Washington State.
Okay, any objections to us accrediting Puget Sound anglers with Dave as their rep? Okay, no objection. That's a little bit out of order, but we'll take it.
I thank you for letting me do that at the last minute. I missed the meeting due to my mother had a stroke, so I couldn't get up there this time. Thanks for accommodating me.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I think we can summarize in the notes what we heard today on this potential changes to save money, and relay that back to the commission, to the commissioners. And I think we're supposed to wrap up now because there is a poster session, so we'll stop there unless, wait, Monica wants to.
Sorry, not the poster session. Yeah, so the Fishery Independent Satellite Survey question and answer session for the request for tenders, and that's going to be in the AM room, just where we were earlier today.
But poster session as well, happening at the same time.
We'll do that tomorrow. Do we keep the clickers or we need?
Oh yeah, what's the?
Can we please ask everyone to leave the clickers together with nameplate on the table where they currently sit and just return to the same seats tomorrow?
And for those who are voting online, please, I will open the session at least an hour before. If you do want to try to sign in, you can sign in as early as that time, and I'll be ready to help troubleshoot any issues you're having. Please do try to sign in before the meeting starts so we have time to troubleshoot. Thank you.
And just a reminder, the Canadian delegate meeting basically starting now at the same room as last night.
Okay, and for US delegation, we're going to meet at 7, so people have a chance to go to that FIS or poster session, but we'll meet at 7 in the room we met in last night.